I've been a chiropractor for 27 years. I've also gone on to study in chiropractic neurology. I've been doing that for 17 years plus. My senior neurologist was Dr. Melillo, who is going to be speaking tonight. He's not only my senior neurologist when I was going through the neurology program, but he was also my friend and my mentor. I appreciate everything that he's taught me, and he inspired me to open up the Brain Balance Center based upon the studies that he's done and seeing the kids that have gone through his program. I used his techniques at my chiropractic office to help some of the kids that we saw that had Tourette's and ADHD, and I was so impressed with the results we were getting that I decided that my wife and I needed to go and investigate a Brain Balance Center. We did. We went up to New York, spent time up there, seeing the whole program and how it ran, came back, and we decided it was time to open one because these kids need the help. And the results that he's getting with the program and the results we're seeing with the programs since we've been open are just amazing. Dr. Melillo is a chiropractic neurologist. He's got a master's in neuroscience. He runs the Brain Balance Centers. He's also the chief editor for Scientific Magazine on functional neurology. He's the president of the Functional Neurology Council. He's a professor at several colleges as well as in the Carrick neurology program as well. You can see he's got a lot of credentials up there. He's written 2 parents' books. We have one available that will be auctioned off to 10 people. So at the end of this lecture, don't leave. My daughter will pick 10 names out of the container, and we'll give away those books that Dr. Melillo signed. So make sure you stay seating, and then we'll get Emily down here to announce the 10 winners. He's also written a second book besides Disconnected Kids called Reconnected Kids, and he's also signed a contract to write a third book to help parents who are thinking about having children, how to prevent them from having these neural disabilities. He's also written a textbook that's one of the most researched and referenced textbooks on neural development. He's also written chapters in several textbooks on dyslexia and ADHD. I'd like to present my friend, Dr. Melillo.
Well, since he was so nice to me, I'll be nice back. But when we choose Brain Balance Center location, it's a family-run organization. My family, myself are involved in it. It's very personal to us. It's not a business. It's really a mission. And we have 55 centers across the country at this point. When we choose a location, it's not based on demographics or numbers. It's based on the individuals that come to us that petition on behalf of their community and the quality of the individual that we are going to be working with. One of the things we say to them all the time when they go through training, and Mike can tell you this, we say it over and over, if you want to play with our children, you have to be trained very, very well. We look at every kid that we work with in the centers around the country as our kids, as if we work with them ourselves. And, you know, with going throughout the years of being a clinician, 25 years I've been a clinician, over 20 years been involved in neurology and rehabilitation. And one of the most outstanding people I've ever met in any profession is Dr. Michael Swank. He really is just an incredibly dedicated person. He's a genuinely nice person, caring. You know, he became a doctor because he wanted to make a difference in people's lives and change people's lives, and he's done that as well as almost anybody I know. His wife, his family, his children are the same. And when he came to us and said, you know, we want to do a center, we have a long waiting list of people. He jumped right to the top. So we're here because of him and because of what he cares about in his community. And he saw that there was a problem and he wanted to make a difference, and we wanted to be a partner with him in that, and we couldn't be prouder to be here. First thing I want to do is, of course, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being dedicated parents, professionals, whatever it is that brought you here. Just the fact that you take the time to come out makes you unique, makes you special, and I'm always honored to speak to an audience of people who are willing to do whatever it takes to help children, because that's what we're all about. As Dr. Swank said, everything I'm going to talk about is very well referenced. I will also start off with an apology. If there are any high-level clinicians or researchers or people that are into research, I'm going to overgeneralize a little. I'm going to oversimplify a little. Believe me, I know that. But my goal tonight is in an hour or so to try to get some really big concepts across to you. And we're talking about the brain, we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about learning, we're talking about some pretty complex issues. So I have to kind of overgeneralize a little to get those across. But if anybody wants more specific scientific references, these are some of the textbooks that I've published. As Mike said, this is neurobehavioral disorders is used in many graduate and postgraduate programs in psychology, neuropsychology, medicine. It's used at UCLA Medical School. As you can see in the middle, it's been translated to Korean and Chinese. These are just some of the journals that we publish articles in. Besides doing this, my main job is I head up a research lab. I'm the director of a research lab, a brain research lab, and that is what I spend a lot of my time doing, actually doing research and working with other top researchers. We have labs not only in the United States, but also in other countries like Israel, and we are working on cutting-edge research at this very moment. But we've published a lot of articles in some of the top journals. These are some of the articles that we published. Our lab alone in the last 2.5 years has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles in various scientific and medical journals around the world. This is the journal, it's a scientific journal that I'm the co-editor-in-chief of. Again, it's a fully peer-reviewed journal. We have some of the top researchers in the world that are on the editorial board, and we're publishing great research out of that. This is a book, Disconnected Kids, that if you want more explanation or more detail on what I'm going to talk about tonight, I suggest you just pick the book up. It's very inexpensive, and it's a real tool that you can actually utilize a lot of what we use in our centers at home. And I get letters from around the world every day from people using this, not just parents, but also professionals. A lot of professions are actually using this to teach as a teaching model. There's universities where teaching programs are using it. There's been various other, like occupational therapy and psychology professionals that have taught webinars and seminars using my book. But it really gives a good explanation of everything we're going to go through tonight. It has also been translated in Korean and Chinese. This is a book, Reconnected Kids, which is a follow-up to Disconnected Kids, which came out in 2009, and it came out this year in April. And it is, the first book is really about understanding the brain, development of the brain, and how it can go awry, and how we can change it, how we can literally change brain function. But as you do that, sometimes you see dramatic changes in behavior that can be confusing to parents because they may not look good at times. A child who is relatively easygoing may become very emotional, may appear to be oppositional, and may become a more difficult child. In other words, they become more like a normal child. And so we need to explain that to parents. So that's what this book was about. It's about giving parents ways of looking at that and monitoring it and checking it out based on a scale, based on age and behavior. It also gives parents ways of dealing with those behavioral changes as they come about. And also, the end of the book is really a very positive psychology approach for any parent of any child, which is about how to really make children successful in today's day and age with all the different things that we have to compete against, like the internet and texting and digital technology that our children are bombarded with. How do we keep their attention and keep them focused and instill our values and our beliefs in our children and not let them get swept away by this media storm that they're subjected to every day. We've learned a lot from working with children with behavioral issues, but you know, every parent today faces behavioral challenges because of our day and age. So that's what that book's about. How many people here are country music fans? How many people here know who Zach Brown is? Okay. He's a good friend of mine. He and I are actually working on a book right now. He is very dedicated to helping children with disabilities. His first album is called The Foundation because he has a children's foundation. He has purchased 500 acres in Georgia to build a camp for disabled children that nobody will ever pay to go for. He's raising $25 million on his own to do that. And he's building it all around the principles of my book. And this is because as a kid, he went to a camp like that had typical children and disabled children. And although he himself was not disabled, he worked with these kids every summer, and he found it a very important part of his life. He became a counselor and eventually a staff member, and at one point thought that that was his calling, to work with children with disabilities. He had other callings. One was he's a master chef. He loves to cook, and he had his own restaurant at one point, but then he sold his restaurant to buy a tour bus, and the rest is kind of history. He's been the most successful artist in the history of country music. He's the first one that has ever had 5 #1 hits off his debut album, and he's had 4 #1 hits off his second album, and he's currently working on his third. Because he's a chef, he believes very much in nutrition and diet. He practices very strictly with his 4 girls. And so he and I are doing a cookbook for children with disabilities and people with food sensitivities that will be coming out probably around this time next year, hopefully. So he's a great guy, and he really supports this community of children with learning differences. So you should support him. He's really great. Go see him if he comes here. At every concert, he stands up and talks about brain balance and my book. So what we want to do tonight is go through 4 questions that you probably may have. One is, if this is the first time you're hearing about brain balance and brain balance program, what is it? What's it about? What makes it unique? What's the research that it's based on? And are there any outcomes? Are there any statistical data that we have on our program? And are there any downsides to the program or potential risks? So first of all, what are we talking about? We're talking about children and adolescents. We work with kids from basically 4.5 to 19, essentially school-age kids. And what we see is literally an epidemic rise in numbers of children. Now, there's some controversy because there's 2 things that we look at. One is called prevalence, which means what are the numbers of individuals that are diagnosed with a specific disorder? And nobody will argue that those numbers have increased dramatically over the past 2 decades. To give you an idea, autism 20 years ago was diagnosed approximately 1 out of 10,000 children. It's now, according to the CDC in 2009, diagnosed 1 out of every 110, or 1 in 70 boys. And many people believe that that's a very, very conservative estimate. And those statistics are actually already 4 or 5 or 6 years old. So it's probably significantly worse than that. One of the clues that we have into that is that in May, there was a study that came out of South Korea. Now, when we do this study to look at prevalence or the numbers of people with a disorder in the United States, we do mostly paper surveys, some phone surveys, but basically send out forms to doctors and schools and parents and ask them about their children. And there's a certain amount of accuracy, but there's a certain amount of inaccuracy to that. So in Korea, in South Korea, they did what's called a population-based study, which is much more accurate. They literally go into the schools and actually count the physical bodies of children that have autism. And what they found was that it was 1 in 38, or 1 in 20 boys. So when somebody went to our CDC and said, what if we did a population-based study here, what would we find? And they said, probably the same thing, or maybe even worse than that. So we're looking at a huge rise in numbers. When we look at ADHD, we're looking at probably somewhere around a 2,000% increase in the last 20 years. Where now we look at 1 out of every 10 children is diagnosed with ADHD. Most people will look at that, and again, there are 2 different sides of the story. Some people say, well, we're just recognizing these numbers more. It doesn't mean that there are actually more cases, which is what we call incidence. So we have an increased prevalence, but not an increased incidence. And that they argue that it's 1% of the population of children, and it's always been 1%. They used to think that in Korea until they did this study, and now they realize that it's almost 3% of their population. But although this question won't be answered anytime soon, I can tell you that I've surveyed thousands, literally thousands of teachers and educators in school systems. And every time I meet a teacher or go to a school system, I say, do you guys see more children with problems? Do you notice that there are actually more kids with these issues? Common sense. Go around and speak to your neighbors or families, or you are families that may be impacted by this. We didn't have this many children 10, 15, 20 years ago. We are seeing absolutely an increase in numbers of children, which means that we're seeing an epidemic rise in these numbers. Now, when we hear that right away, we think, well, what's causing it? Well, again, when we look at the overall numbers, and this is the population of kids that we work with, we're looking at ADHD is the single largest disorder, which is about 10%, or 1 in 10 children. We look at dyslexia and learning disabilities conservatively are another 15 to 20%, with dyslexia making up 85% of that. Autism spectrum disorder is conservatively 1 to 2%. Overall, what we see in most school districts around the country, we're seeing 20 to 25% of children qualify for special ed services. And that's the kids that we work with. And this is increasing dramatically. It represents almost 20 million children in the United States. ADHD, as I said, is the single largest problem. It's the leading childhood disorder in the world of any kind. It's the #1 reason why a child will be medicated. 70 to 80% of all medications prescribed for children for any reason are ADHD medications. We see that the increase in production and assume the diagnosis of ADHD has increased almost 2,000% over the past 20 years. And we know that children with ADHD, adolescents with ADHD, at least 70%, maybe 80%, have at least one other diagnosis, usually OCD and or Tourette's or tic disorders. So these are really almost seen all the time together. So they all go together. We know that ADHD and all of these disorders really have a lifelong impact. I just did a radio show today, and the host said to me, don't these kids outgrow this problem? And that was our thinking many years ago, that these children, if we just got them through elementary school, whether through medication or behavioral management, that we could just get them through that period and then they would be okay. We now realize that that's not the case. That there's a dropout rate in high schools of 32% ADHD teenagers versus 15% of typical teenagers. That there's a 300% risk of substance abuse in teenagers that have ADHD. We know that there's a 200% chance of them being obese. We know that there's a 300% risk of them showing up in an ER with an injury. We also know that if you have one member of the family with ADHD or autism, that the divorce rate is 70 or 80% or more. We also know that it doesn't end there, that there's a 300% risk of dementia later on in life if you were diagnosed with ADHD. So this is something that has tremendous impact throughout the course of someone's life on whether they actually go through school. And the average ADHD teen has a higher IQ than the average child, but yet they drop out of school at twice the rate. That's not a really good mixture for society, right? That's usually a child or an individual that's going to end up in jail or with substance abuse issues or something worse. We know that there's also a tremendous financial impact on the families of people that have these children. So we know that the average family of a child with ADHD will spend $15,000 a year just maintaining that. This was a government study that was done a couple of years ago, that for autistic families it's $30,000 a year in direct and indirect medical costs and support and counseling just to try to maintain the problem. It just doesn't affect the families, it affects everybody in the community, because what we also know is that every child that has a special ed certification in most school districts is going to cost between $60,000 to $80,000. Some school districts, it's over $100,000 per child per year. So we see that this impacts not only the families, but also the other families that are taxpayers in the community. We also know that although we've recognized more and more that we're seeing an epidemic rise in these disorders, what we also see at the same time is an unprecedented cut in services in school systems because of the economic times that we're in. And some of the first services that are cut are special ed services. So then these children that should be in special ed programs end up in regular classes with teachers that are overwhelmed already, not trained to work with these children, and now they impact the other children that don't have a disability, and now those children don't get the education that they should be getting. So there's a trickle-down effect where this really affects everybody. The only solution is to try to eliminate this problem, not to manage it, not to compensate, but to eliminate it. And I'm here and I'm going to describe to you that this is something that can be eliminated, and we've shown this time and time again. Now again, when we look at all of these disorders, what we see is not only is there a high comorbidity, meaning that we see multiple diagnoses in many children, but also this was a study done in the Scandinavian countries in Denmark that looked at the rise in autism in Scandinavia and then compared it to the rise in ADHD, Tourette's, and OCD. And what they found was that it was exactly the same. And this is what most studies have shown, is that all of these disorders are increasing at the same rate. So although we may hear more about autism or ADHD, they're all rising at the same rate, and you're going to see that that's because the thinking now is they all have the same underlying problem. And we know this because when we do real sophisticated brain imaging, we can see that the exact same areas of the brain are involved in all of these children, although they may all present